I want to welcome everyone into this workshop today, Gearing Up for Change, and I'm going to hand it over to Teaghan to start things off.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So I'm just going to give you a quick idea of what's going to be happening today. So we'll be starting off with some explanation and some talking from Noella and Stevie, and then going into an exercise that will be based on the cause and effect of climate-forced displacement. And then after that, we'll be hearing from Rachel from Side with Love about local effects climate change has had on your community and communities around you. So I'll start off the introductions with my name is Teaghan. My pronouns are she and her. I'm calling in from Maryland on the land of the Piscataway people. And my role in the seminar is that I'm the youth dean. So I'll hand it off to Noella.
Hello, I'm Noella. I use she and they pronouns, and I am from Vancouver on the traditional unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and I am also one of your youth deans. Stevie, do you want to introduce yourself?
You're muted, Stevie.
Ooh, learning. Hello, everyone. My name is Stevie Carmody. I use he, him pronouns. I'm calling in from Lenape land here in Queens, New York City, and I'm really glad to be here. And last, can I pass it to Rachel?
Sure. Thanks, Stevie. I'm Rachel Myslivy. I use she or they pronouns, and I'm currently located in Galesburg, Illinois on Peoria land. I'm happy to be here.
So now that we've kind of discussed what we're going to be talking about today, explained our goals, let's get started with the framework that we have created to help us understand how climate-forced displacement fits into the bigger picture and also impacts individual communities. Picture in your head a tree. This tree represents a social justice issue that's present in our world. It has roots, a trunk, and lots of branches. The roots represent systemic causes of the social justice issue. For example, during Saturday's keynote presentation, we all learned that social and economic inequalities can be a major root cause of people being displaced in many cases. The trunk is all the ideologies and institutions that hold this issue in place. For example, we learned about legal systems not fully accounting for climate change refugees during our theme panel on Tuesday. And the roots in the trunk grow up into branches and leaves, which are the real effects that show up in every community. For example, during our workshop with Maida Owens, we learned how being displaced can lead to a loss of culture for many communities. Now, Stevie is going to tell us some stories that will help us understand how the roots of the problem can extend into many different areas.
Thanks, Noella. And we'll be spending a little bit more time with that tree, but I thought I would offer another set of stories to illustrate what we're sort of talking about, from the roots to the trunks to the branches and leaves. So it's a personal story, but in my formation to becoming a minister, I had the privilege of serving as an intern minister at a congregation in the San Diego area. And as you may know, San Diego is a border town, and it's on the border with Tijuana in Mexico, and much of the culture is binational. And this internship happened over the course of a year, and it started in 2018 and went through June 2019. And if you remember, during that time in national politics, you'll remember 2018 was the time that there was a lot of national scare around something that was called the Migrant Caravan. There was a large movement of migrants through Central America, through Mexico, and towards the US border, folks that were seeking asylum and safety and a better life in the United States. And there was and the administration at the time used this this wave of immigration as a justification for increased militarization and surveillance and rejection of those who sought asylum in our country, the legally protected right of asylum. And as also a side effect of this, the rhetoric and the policies and those actions that were all taken led to a really dehumanizing effect for those who were seeking safety in our country through racism, through xenophobia. Now, to prepare for serving at a congregation that was bilingual, I took my kind of okay Spanish and spent most of the summer in 2018 doing language school down in Guatemala, and actually learned from a lot of people who had been involved in some of the revolutionary activity that had happened in Guatemala over the second half of the 20th century. But I remember on my first day being in one of the schools close to the city of Sheila and meeting a teen who, in our conversation, he was telling me about once the summer sort of subsided and the heat of the summer subsided, that he was planning to go to the United States. And he was very interested to learn from me about the United States and what was possible. And I had my misgivings knowing the cruelty of the administration at that time, not sure what was going to meet him as he had tried to approach the border. But I just remember this moment of meeting this person and being on the other side of the chain around migration. Over the course of that summer, while learning Spanish in that country, I also learned a lot of the history, which was very important for them to teach to us. And I learned a lot about the history of United States colonialism and capitalism in the country of Guatemala. I learned about the coup d'etat that was supported by United Fruit Company, executed by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, that deposed the democratically elected President Arbenz in 1954, and the planting of a pro-US business dictator, Armas. It was through lobbying by US companies like the United Fruits Company that led to this policy decision by the United States to unseat an entire government to make it more available for US corporations to flourish in that country. And one of the big effects that happened after the coup d'etat was a lot of the land that people were farming for subsistence, for their own livelihoods, got taken over by the United Fruit Company and other large US conglomerates. And that those farming practices also led to the destruction of the land that was farmable there in Guatemala. And that has played out over many decades since that coup d'etat, and more you've seen the privatization of farmland to larger corporations, and really like a colonialist project that has destroyed a lot of the farming land of Guatemala. Right now, Guatemalans have faced a brunt of some climate crisis imposed impacts, like flooding and drought have both escalated, both in those extremes over the course of time. And along with like the ongoing corruption in some of the US supported governments in Guatemala, poverty and corruption and hunger has really been a theme in that country. So it's no wonder that people might need to flee gang violence, or flee environmental destruction, or flee intense amount of poverty that they're facing in that country. And I hope that by the explanation, the story I've told, like you can see the threads of how colonialism and capitalism and the climate crisis are threading together to create this situation that back in the summer of 2018, I was only told was just this scary thing coming from the South by the national media or something like that, some xenophobic claims about those people and what they were seeking. throughout the course of my internship year, there was a lot of organizing on the border. And one of the really powerful responses to, or one of the powerful responses to the situation that was happening in Tijuana, where folks were arriving, was an outpouring of volunteer work that was based in an interfaith coalition, of which our Unitarian Universalist congregation took place. And so many nights I would go to these makeshift shelters that were set up because the state and local governments were not necessarily taking the lead on it, but it was volunteer organizations and non-governmental organizations that were coming in to supply food and water and to provide legal services for, and provide medical services for, and clothing for people who were seeking asylum, helping them figure out basically like where they needed to be next so that they could await their asylum hearing here in the United States safely and get them to that destination. So over the course of many months, this whole project, this organizing project, an interfaith organizing project, was able to at least respond to humanely this, what I understand is a climate forced and colonialism forced migration of folks, and at least receive and help shepherd folks onto the next place that they were. And so as we're stepping into this workshop where we're thinking about both the roots of this theme that we've been working on all week, I also want to connect it to a story of how a community can respond and come together around that. So that's my story. In brief, there's more to it, but I would emphasize that it's very important to me to share some of that story, and that if you're curious about learning more about US involvement in Central America, I think it's really a story that's really worth telling and deserves to be spread. Can I pass it to Teaghan to lead us into a little bit of analysis? And we're going to try out using this tree that Noella was describing.
Yeah, so I would like to invite anybody who is willing or able to grab a piece of paper or something that you can draw on, and a writing implement to do that with. And and then we also have a slide coming up here as well. I'm just gonna wait a minute for people to come back.
Teaghan, is that slide showing up for you?
Yes.
Okay. I'm ready to scribe.
Okay. So making sure many people are back grabbing their things. So while we are doing this exercise, I would invite you to use that pen and paper that you just got to draw a tree. It can look something like this or nothing like this if you would like. A sort of rough outline. I trust that you can visualize a tree enough to make that happen. And with this tree, you'll also notice our tree up on our beautiful slide here. We're going to be talking about the levels of climate force displacement, like Noella was explaining earlier. So right now, I would invite you all, after you're done drawing your tree, to put into chat some things that we would call that we were going to put on the roots. So that would be systemic causes. For an example, like Stevie said earlier, colonialization was a great example of systemic root causes for climate force displacement. And as we're doing this exercise, if we're going to be focusing on the roots and the trunk of the tree, and then after this, we'll be moving out into breakout rooms to discuss more of the leaves, which will be local effects. But if you have any local effects come to mind, feel free to write them in your tree, and you will have an opportunity to talk about that in a couple minutes. Okay, so I'm seeing in the chat climate chaos and inequality and unfairness in distribution of wealth. Excuse me. White supremacy ideology, greed. I'll give Stevie a second to type. Fossil fuel industry-based foreign policy. So yeah, for sure. Exploitation and objectification, definitely. Indifference. I'll give Stevie a second. We have, yeah, capitalism we have up there, along with materialism, for sure. Okay, great. I think we've got sort of a good idea of these like sort of big root causes. So now I'd like to narrow it down slightly to talk about this the trunk of our proverbial tree. So for the trunk, that will be instead of systemic causes, it'll be institutions that support it. So when we're talking about things like capitalism or foreign policy, we can talk about the governments that are making these things, enforcing these things. Excuse me. So American foreign policy, autocratic governments, global corporatism, there you go. Belief that happiness is material. That's interesting. I like that. Excuse me, sorry. Okay. I'll let legal institutions. Oh, I missed manifest destiny. Thank you. And ignoring indigenous and rights of nature. Definitely. I'm gonna try to read this out. I'm gonna be honest, I do not know how to say this word. Postcentrism? Postcentrism?
Alien, can you tell us what that means?
Yeah.
Sure, it's the ideology that everything that we do is centered on the human experience as opposed to everything else in the world, in the natural world.
That's awesome. Thank you, for sure. Okay. So I think you sort of got a handle on that, and seeing how we're narrowing down our tree into smaller and smaller ideas. So now we are going to, like I alluded to before, we're going to head out into some breakout rooms. And our goal for these breakout rooms is for us to discuss some local impacts of climate change and climate force displacement. And as local as you want to get, you are welcome to. This will lead into Rachel, like I said earlier, we'll be talking about climate change locally as well. So yeah, I think That's all. And oh, and if you'd like to add on to your own personal trees that you've drawn for yourself with roots and trunks along with branches and leaves, you are more than welcome to. And we're hoping for this to be more of a casual discussion, and so that if and you can be an inspiration to others if you have know something about your area that maybe someone else doesn't, and spark that knowledge in somebody else. So with that, I think we are good to go out into our breakout rooms.
Reflect on how the climate force displacement can show up in every community. And quickly before we move on, I just want to point out that during this tree activity, that you might have noticed that the very same root causes in the same trunk might also relate to other issues, which is why it's really important to think about intersectionality when we're talking about any social justice issue. Because, for example, colonialism was a root that we mentioned, a root cause of climate force displacement, but it's also a root cause of racism and a lot of other things. So it's very important to notice that when you're attacking the root cause of a certain issue, you can also be helping another issue at the same time. And it can be very overwhelming to know where to start when you're trying to take action on any issue. But we will be talking about the different ways to help very soon. And I'm honored to introduce Rachel, who is going to be leading us in the second part of this workshop. And yeah, Rachel, take it away.
Thank you so much, Noella. If we could, I'll take a quick minute to give some reactions or gratitude for the folks who started us off today. That'd be great. So give some love in the chat or do some of the reactions to tell them thank you for their wonderful work, especially our youth leaders here, our young adult leaders. I am Rachel Myslivy. I'm the climate justice organizer for the Side with Love organizing strategy team. And we're going to continue exploring how climate force displacement can show up in every community with particular emphasis on how you can take effective action in your local communities. Can I get a thumbs up if y'all can see my slide? Okay, thanks so much. Okay, so I want to start by debunking just a few myths about climate force displacement. I think one of the attitudes limiting climate action in general is the idea that climate change happens like over there in some other country, and it affects those other people who don't look or act or think like me. And it's not a problem in my community. And the reality is that climate change is happening now, and it's happening in every community, and it impacts everyone, but some communities are impacted worse than others. And climate force displacement is in the news every day. So I just pulled a couple from the last couple of weeks here. Most recently, we've got wildfires in New Mexico, Arizona, and Nebraska that have destroyed hundreds of homes, burned tens of thousands of acres, and caused thousands to evacuate. So this is a picture from the fires in Ruidoso, New Mexico. It's destroyed, as of about a week ago, over 200 homes. Whoops. Similarly, flooding is causing displacement as well, like this town in Tennessee. And again, these are just from the last couple of weeks. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, the 2020 wildfires in the United States triggered the majority of displacements in the United States, with about 26,000 displacements from wildfires, and flooding triggered about 17,000 displacements. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration tracks the number of billion-dollar weather and climate disasters. And in 2021, there were 20 weather climate disasters with losses exceeding 1 billion in the United States. That included 1 drought, 2 flooding events, 11 severe storms, 4 tropical cyclones, 1 wildfire, and 1 winter storm. Overall, those caused the deaths of about 730 people, with significant economic impacts, of course. Interestingly, the average of extreme weather events, or billion-dollar disasters, from 1980 to 2021 was about 7.7. And in the last 5 years, the average is 17.8. So it's more than doubled the average in the last 5 years. So we ask ourselves, as people of faith, what can we do to respond? To me, the first thing you ask is, what are the climate risks that are impacting your community? How is your community impacted? Who is most at risk? what can we do to prepare or to respond, and what can we do to prepare? And sometimes I think it's easier to see what has happened and look back at what happened and think about the impacts, and that can help you prepare for the future, which is why I put how do we respond with how we can prepare. So I'm going to give a quick example as something that I've seen happen in the past that might help me cast forward to be more prepared in the future. So for about 20 years, I lived in Lawrence, Kansas, and Kansas experienced extreme weather events of all kinds, heat and cold and floods, droughts, fires, tornadoes. Earthquakes were never a problem until the past 5 or 10 years, when earthquakes were coming up more because of drilling, fracking. But for this example, I'm going to dig into flood impacts. So flooding happens in that community all the time, and especially in the spring. It impacts the whole community, but some areas of the community worse. Usually in the east and the north parts of the city, flooding could make roads impassable and flood homes, etc. Especially the homes in the lower lying areas around the river that were traditionally lower income housing and has a lot of rental units. And most of those rental units are older and inefficient. So when flooding occurs in the warmer months, mold is quick to grow, and these low-income renters and inefficient housing also experience really high electricity bills, and they're often a concern all year round. But in the summer months, when the temperatures can go over 100 for multiple weeks at a time, and humidity, especially after a flood event, is incredibly high. There's no summer like hot weather rule to protect people. So if their electricity bill is too high and they can't afford to pay it, their electricity will get shut off in the summertime. So air conditioning is a luxury for a lot of people, even though, like I said, the temperatures can be oppressive. Floods are getting worse and more frequent, and the floodwater management systems, especially in these lower income communities, are failing over and over. So when I think about, so that's an example of a climate impact in my community. And I would ask myself to think about, what does the reality look like with a human face? Sometimes the data can feel just sort of cold and calculating. So even if you don't know a specific person that this impacts, you can think about a person, like create a fictional character. So I'll do one for this example. So say there's a single mother of two. She lives in a 2-bedroom rental in North Lawrence, which is the area that has the high rental population and the worst impacts from flooding. Both of her kids have asthma. When the flood struck her neighborhood, they had to stay in a hotel because there was standing water in the kids' bedrooms. After the waters receded, she found mold growing in the carpet of the kids' rooms. The landlord was, of course, non-responsive, so she had to try to figure out what to do on her own limited budget. The carpet is damp all the time, and with the summer heat, the mold is getting worse. They only have window air conditioning units that only work sometimes, and she can only use them when it's really, really bad outside and it's impacting the kids' asthma and allergies, which is, of course, worse after the floods as well. So she ended up having to stay home to take care of her kids because they got sick from the mold and the asthma attacks. And then, of course, guess what? She loses her job, which means she loses her primary income and she loses her health insurance. And she's quickly forced into the situation of paying to clean up mold in a house that is not her own, to pay her electricity bills or pay for her food or pay for her kids' inhalers and medical bills. So within a few months, the eviction notices will start rolling in, and what will she do then? So this scenario reflects the short-term crisis, the standing waters forcing the family from their home, as well as the long-term impacts of displacement, sickness, unemployment, and economic distress. So again, this is building on what you were just doing a minute ago. I'd like to ask you to take maybe just a minute or two to kind of silently reflect on the climate risks in your community. You can look at this slide and think about how you would answer those two things. So what are the climate disasters that impact your community? And in the worst case scenario, which of your neighbors, not those people, but which of your neighbors would it impact the most and how? So again, just take until about 6:45, silently reflecting, and then we'll get into small groups. Okay. I don't want to rush your silent reflection. As an introvert, I need silent reflection like I need water, but I also recognize we're kind of running low on time. So I'd like to have everybody break out into groups of one-on-one. And in your conversation, I'd like you to consider how you can cultivate a community of care that can respond to these kinds of climate disasters. So looking at the slide again, consider the following, how could your congregation help those most impacted immediately following a climate disaster? Could you help with cleanup efforts or protective equipment for cleanup or shelter for evacuees? How could your congregation help address the longer term impacts following a disaster? Could your community volunteer to do weatherization? I heard last night on a green sanctuary cohort call, somebody's congregation is doing carbon offsets by investing in weatherizing low-income houses in their communities, which is brilliant. Could you volunteer to go with tenants to talk to their landlords about these issues? Could you provide long-term shelter for folks? And then think about what you could do now to help your community prepare for this potential worst case scenario. Could you advocate for increased insight or oversight on landlords, for example, or simply help prepare some go bags if you're in an area with floods or with wildfires, excuse me. So you'll have, let's see, probably until maybe 6:55 in your one-on-one groups. And again, consider these questions and just kind of talk it out amongst yourselves. And then we'll come back and have just a little bit of sharing at the end. So with that, I will ask Rob to send folks into breakout rooms. Here you all come back, and I see at least a couple people smiling. That's always a good sign. Nice to see you all. Oh, I've got some arms in the air and thumbs up. That's even better. Oh, another thumbs up. Thanks everybody for, I hope your conversations together were fruitful. I'd like to ask, would anybody like to step forward and unmute yourself and share some of your conversation?
Well, we were talking about something which is maybe a little bit unusual, and that is the possibility of helping people to preserve their artifacts, like, for example, family photos, and of course, critical documents and things like that. If you prepare for the possibility of maybe getting flooded or something like that by scanning photos and documents, it would be somewhat less traumatic, maybe, if it actually does happen, and help you to reestablish yourself later on.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a great idea. You could host a congregation-wide event to do something like that and invite the community. Right. Beautiful. Right. Anyone else?
I'd like to say, to reinforce that, I've been a climate activist for 20 years, and this little exercise really spurred a lot of thinking for me about preparing for extreme weather events in our area. And I'm going to use it to inform others, including our municipal leaders, which we are working on and encouraging to declare a climate emergency with a youth organization that grew out of Greta Thunberg's Fridays for Future, and start to really prepare climate action plans. And you've given me, you just kicked off a great deal of thoughts and ideas that we can implement here. And I thank you.
Good. I'm so glad to hear that. And please steal my materials, share them to get people to start taking action. So those are two examples. One is kind of a technical community thing that you can do. And another is more of a systemic political action you could do to try to encourage climate action plans. Sure. Who else would like to share? Go ahead and unmute yourself and start talking.
I'll say it was interesting for me. I live in a room with Noella, and I live right next to DC, and I didn't even think about townhouses and probably, if I were to guess, only a little bit under half of the housing in DC are basement housing, and we are starting to get more and more floods, and how that will affect them. And so that's something interesting. I just hadn't thought about before. That's very, very close to me.
Excellent. Thank you, Teaghan. Would anybody else like to share? We have time for probably 2 more quick share outs. Stacy?
Well,
Oh, go ahead, Joe.
I'm sorry, I forgot to raise my hand first.
Okay.
Well, it turns out Bill McPherson and I were on the same track about our congregations, or at least our environment committees, seeking to work with other churches, other faith groups in town to pay special attention to the needs of the migrants and people of color who will be most severely impacted.
Definitely.
So it's a good idea to establish some lines of communication with other local places of worship if you haven't got them already.
Beautiful. There's an example of in the wildfires that happened in Northern California. I think it was just last year. I read stories about how the Spanish-speaking household workers, like the women and people who would go and clean houses, were still showing up to work in places that had been evacuated because nobody thought to call them and tell them not to come. So there were these, domestic workers going to clean houses that had been evacuated while they were endangering their lives to go to work because nobody thought to tell them, don't go to work today, and they didn't want to get fired. So that's a great example of how congregations could do that kind of outreach to make sure people got that kind of alerts.
Wow.
Anybody else? It looked like I saw Stacy raise her hand, and then it looks like Bonnie's unmuted. So if you want to go ahead and share it, that'd be great.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, in Plainfield, New Jersey, which I live close to, there are several number of Central American migrants in this area. And I'm thinking in terms of things I could do is get myself more involved with those organizations.
Absolutely.
Because they provide advocacy, they provide housing, and they need that, as well as language lessons. So,
Perfect.
And maybe get an encouragement. In the past, our congregation has been involved with this, and we should reinstate that.
Yeah, that's a great example of trying to work in partnership with frontline communities. Absolutely. We have time for one more if anybody wants to share.
Well, this just came up, and it's something that I've never heard or never thought of before. But Ned was sharing about the amazing efforts to check on every single person after Superstorm Sandy. And we talked about that one thing we could do to be prepared is to build relationships amongst neighbors and literally just get more accustomed to not thinking we always have to do it all our own, but building those relationships, connections, and opportunities so that when disasters, when worst case scenarios happen, we already have some of those bonds established. We know who to call.
Absolutely. It's a beautiful example of community care. Thank you all. I'd love to hear what everybody came up with, but I know we have a little bit of a schedule to keep, and I want to make sure to give a quick overview of the Action Center for the Side with Love team. The Side with Love Action Center is a place to harness the power of our faith to build the communities we need to contend with these systems of oppression that create multiple intersecting crises. Like somebody mentioned, they've had a couple of the intersections come out as with race and climate and immigration, et cetera. So the Side with Love organizing strategy team put forward this action center with the intention of skilling up our community and joining actions to advance our values and build that grassroots power we need. We focus on the 4 intersectional justice priorities, which is creating climate justice, the vote and democracy, LGBTQ and gender and reproductive justice, and love resists. The Action Center is a place where you can learn, grow, and act together to strengthen our faith's capacity to meet this critical moment and tip the scales towards love and justice. And we try to organize it that political action can occur at all of these levels, with national training and actions to state action, volunteer teams, and local distributed actions. So we do this in 3 ways. We encourage people to participate in 3 ways. You can amplify, which is organizing your community to join our political education events. Or hosting watch parties, et cetera, or sharing recordings. So you might encourage your congregation to watch this video, for example. Multiply is organizing your congregation to join our monthly national actions or to host local distributed actions in your community. And ground is to organize your community to work with partners to build local power around those justice priorities. So the participant who talked about maybe working with the community organizations who do outreach to the Spanish-speaking people in their community, that would be an opportunity to ground. We provide structure and resources to strengthen your on-the-ground organizing, including monthly community of praxis meetings and skill ups, along with regular trainings and resources. This is the Spring Skill Up series. In the one coming up on May 15th is how do I get people to care to build strong grassroots actions for justice. You may also look at the previous videos or previous presentations all recorded and they're on sidewithlove.org. We love to hear what people are doing on the ground and ask folks to tell us the actions that you're taking through a story, team report and storytelling form. We also want to know what you need. So these monthly community of praxis meetings talk about how to build a team and how to strengthen relationships with partners, how to use the Action Center and spiritual grounding and practice, et cetera. We also have volunteer squads. So if you want to plug into the work that we're doing at any level, you're welcome to join. And also, if you have events that you would like to get visible at a national level, you can add them with the sidewithlove.org/events. You can also see what local events are happening in your area. I want to, whoops. Okay, here, there we go. Sorry, I was clicking on my slide and it was opening up the website, which is not what I wanted it to be doing. So I'm going to give you a quick sneak peek of some of the things that we have coming up. There's for Create Climate Justice, of course, the Intergenerational Spring Seminar on Displacement and Human Rights. We have thrown our efforts behind the Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice efforts to advocate for the Water Resources Development Act. So you can do a click to call to be connected to your congresspeople, or you can email them. And hopefully of particular interest to y'all on this call, we are hosting a workshop in the mid part of May on fostering local climate resilience through the disaster response and community care. So that will feature the Trauma Response Ministry and Disaster Relief Fund, and you'll hear from a congregation who received disaster relief funds following a climate disaster and how they worked with their frontline community leadership. We're hosting pods to read the annual read of Defund Fear. We've hosted recently a Speak Up for Trans Lives spokesperson training, which you can watch online. And then of course there's UU the Vote, which is a great way to put your faith into action. So that's the end of that. More than anything, I hope you take away from this that there are always things that you can be doing now to help prepare your communities and to help build those communities of care. So when climate disasters strike, your community will be stronger and more resilient in the face of these challenging times. And finally, again, I'd love to invite you to check out the sidewithlove.org Action Center and figure out how to get involved. We will be soon launching a climate squad to help folks who are most particularly interested in climate change to take action. So thank you all for your time. That's all I got.